Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for April 20th, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy, but more importantly, who's that guy?
Hey!
Who's this guy?
How's it going, everybody?
Oh,
It's been a while. It's been a few
JD.
weeks.
Hi,
Yeah.
buddy.
How we doing? It's good to see you.
Oh,
good
you
to talk
too, man.
to you.
You too, man. It's deja vu all over again. It's like you've never gone I mean, you never really did go anywhere. We just
Yeah,
haven't
I've
seen
been
your
around,
face
yeah.
or heard your voice all that much.
Yeah, I've just been in the back eating everyone's cookies and ice cream. So I've been here just.
You've also been just too busy salivating over the early tweets for Peter Pan and Wendy.
Oh my
from what I
gosh.
understand.
When you start comparing Peter Pan and Wendy, a film that I'm already looking forward to, primarily because of its director, but I do like that story material.
Yeah.
And you compare that to one Terrence Malick, especially in the vein of For Kids. Yes, please. I am down for that. I want that. Inject that into my veins, please.
I mean, it's hard not to be surprised by that, though, and it's mostly because Disney's dumping this on Disney Plus. Of course, the movie's gonna be good.
Yeah. I don't think we have any reason to doubt David Lowery at this point.
Yeah.
And I really want that to be true for a couple of reasons. Not only, as I noted, do we love David Lowery.
Right.
You know, I'm a sucker for the Peter Pan narrative, the idea of never growing up, being a child forever, because that's who I am. It speaks to my core. That's great.
You represent the millennial generation perfectly. That's what we're all about. That's like our ethos. Like you look up millennial in the dictionary, it's wanting to be children forever, acting like children forever.
I look, I love that. That's definitely a me thing. And then you compare it to Malick. Oh, that you will get me there. And then also, I just love the idea of David Lowery. And this is why I also want this to really be true. David Lowery getting millions of dollars from Disney to just go off and do his own thing that's not the conventional Disney bubble, and they get that product back there. What is this? Like, what is this?
Oh,
we
my
can't put
God.
this in theaters. Dump that on Disney Plus.
He is right now. If the movie is as good as people are saying it is, he is maybe the best example of the one for me, one for you filmmaker mentality. At least working today.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, even the one for thems that he's been doing are still really good. Like, he doesn't just phone those in.
No, they are still very much Lowry films through and through. And they kind of bridge the gap a little bit, right? I mean, like even a movie like The Old Man and the Gun, as likable as that movie is, it still feels very Lowry-esque. It straddles that line beautifully.
I agree. I think that's what makes him one of the more compelling filmmakers to date. We'll get to that soon. That comes out on Disney Plus next weekend, I believe.
Yes, that will definitely be one of the main reviews we do, if not the core review that weekend.
So we'll get to that very soon. And by we, I don't know if I will be a part of that. I'm not officially back yet. For those that are confused as to what we're talking about.
You're dipping your toes. Yeah, you're slowly making the rounds
Slowly
back.
making my way back. For those of you
just trying to dip your toes in as much as you can and trying to see where the threshold is that Brandy doesn't get mad that you keep doing this.
She's actually been really great.
Okay.
Because even through this hiatus, I've been able to go to the theater and see some movies. You know, I haven't been able to catch up on everything quite yet, but I've been able to go and see some things, and I've been able to, find time to watch movies, and she's been great. I also did a Patreon bonus content episode.
You did, yeah.
That we did a few weeks ago, I believe it was. So, she's
Star
been
Wars Celebration,
really great.
I think is what you were talking about.
Yeah, so, that was a lot of fun. And now I'm here tonight. I'm hoping that in the next week, I'll be able to perhaps join the Showing Up review. We'll see
Yeah.
how timing goes and schedule goes. Because there's this part of it, there's also just like family scheduling stuff where things are going to ramp up here
Sure.
pretty soon.
Sure.
That might get in the way of some things, as well as we have a young baby in the house. there
That's
is
pretty
that.
important. That's pretty
That's kind of the
important.
main reason I've been gone.
That's called priorities right there.
So, been having a lot of fun being a father of a second child. So
Yeah.
so it's been busy, but I'm dipping my toes back in and wanting to kind of get back in the swing of things. I'll probably be back in more of like a full-time-ish status by the end of May. I think is perhaps where we'll be able to, I'll be able to be here a little bit more consistently.
Yeah, we won't make any promises because maybe the current film schedule lineup might bring you back in sooner. I mean, you mentioned a name like Kelly Reichardt there. She has a new film coming out called Showing Up,
Yes.
which we will obviously review when we get the chance to all see it. But when names like that start popping up, someone like you, JD, you're going to be like, listen, Brandy, I got to join this show. I got to join this episode.
Well, and it's funny because, before we hopped on this recording, we had a whole conversation about trying to plan for that because next week is very busy. We are taking the kids here next week. There's a lot of military things happening. So like they have these huge Navy ships that are coming in, and we're going to be taking Andrew and Sam to see those, mostly for Sam, obviously, but he's going to have a lot of fun. And so that's going to take up a few days. There's a huge air show that's coming, and we're taking them to that as well. So there's all of that's happening. And then it's been kind of a big weekend for movies, right? Because
it has.
We have Showing Up, which we're going to hope to get to next week. There's a couple of horror films coming out, one from Ari Aster that is sparking all kinds of controversy.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
Of course it is. So, and that's a 3-hour movie. So I'm trying to figure out, like, can I even get a chance to see Beau is Afraid? I really want to. Showing Up is a movie that is much more doable. I think it's an hour 45, but it's also playing at a theater that's not quite close to my house. It's probably like a good 35 minutes away.
Yeah.
And so it's, we're having to work out those logistics, but I'm going to try to be here for Showing Up. I really want to be.
I think you're going to show up for that one. That's my bet.
Yeah. At any rate, the main thing that we're here to really talk about is the Seattle Kraken. Can they upset the Colorado Avalanche? I say yes.
In session sports, back in session.
Look, the hockey playoffs are in full swing right now.
That's
another thing that's just taking my attention away as well. It's like,
hey, it's that time of year, man. It's understandable.
Yeah. A lot that's happening. All kidding aside, we are here to talk about Makoto Shinkai's new movie, Suzume. I'm very excited to talk about this film. This is a movie that stars Nanoka Hara, Hokuto Matsumura, Eri Fukatsu. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably butchering all those names, so please forgive me. This is a movie that is a modern action adventure road story where a 17-year-old girl named Suzume helps a mysterious young man close doors from the other side that are releasing disasters all over Japan. An intriguing premise, certainly a lot more to get into with this movie. Before we do, though, let's talk a little bit about its director. Let's talk about Makoto Shinkai. What are your feelings about him? What did you think about him as a filmmaker going into this movie?
Admittedly, I'm still kind of blind to most of his work. I think before going into Suzume, I had only seen maybe maybe 3 of his films. And I'm looking at his IMDb page right now. Obviously, I've seen Your Name, and he has he had a very short film. It wasn't a literal short film, but it might as well have been. It was called 5 centimeters per second that I've also seen. That came out in 2007. I believe. So I've seen that. I've seen Your Name. And I think that's it. I actually did not get the chance to see Weathering with You, which was his latest film before Suzume, which we're going to talk about here.
Yeah.
But I like his approach to not just animation but filmmaking in general. He has a tone and he has a niche, we'll say, that he certainly likes to recycle, but there's something very youthful about it that I don't know. Some people have called his films a little bit too tweeny, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And I could certainly see that. A movie like Your Name is littered with pop punk songs that could have been hits in the early 2000s, right?
Yeah.
But there's something kind of nostalgic about that. He has a way of tapping into this in-between stage of nostalgia and tweeny in a way that I kind of admire, which I think will make this conversation on Suzume really interesting. But from what I've seen, I really like what he is doing. I think he has a very vibrant style. And I think Your Name, as far as movies about star-crossed lovers, which is something he also likes to do, I thought that one was really interesting as far as its execution, despite its narrative being rather familiar. I thought it was a really sweet movie.
Yeah, I am with you. I really like Your Name. I did get to see Weathering with You, and that's a film that I also like, don't love.
Okay.
And for reasons we'll get into, I think Suzume falls into a similar camp.
Right.
But he's a director I find fascinating because he loves to build these grand movies in terms of mythos and story, but maybe more prominently in terms of what he's doing visually, in terms of world building. Like it's incredible what he's able to evoke aesthetically and like from an animation standpoint. I think perhaps at times that takes maybe priority over story. We can certainly get into that.
Yeah, there are times, at least with a movie like 5 centimeters per second, which I'm not sure if you've seen. I think that movie actually benefits from its short runtime because at times it almost feels more like an anime vibe of sorts. And there are times I think that if he were to kind of relish in that as a priority, it would actually make for a more emotionally fulfilling experience at times. And maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself with regard to my feelings on Suzume, but there are some filmmakers that are just really good at relishing in vibes and can almost make silent movies out of that without them being officially silent movies.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's something I do appreciate about him as a filmmaker is that he wants to tell these big stories and oftentimes have big emotions with them as well. But he wants you to be completely engulfed in the world from a visual standpoint. And even when the film suffers from that, like I can really appreciate that.
Yeah,
like it's
same.
it's especially because it's very different than something like the world of Miyazaki or Studio Ghibli, which has a lot of lore in their movies, but they take a very different approach. And so, while he certainly wears his influences on his sleeves at times, there are Miyazaki and Ghibli callbacks and Easter eggs in Suzume. So
oh my gosh, you can make a drinking game for how the town that they live in is called Miyazaki.
Yes, it is. Yeah, there's a Whisperer of the Heart callback at one point, I believe.
I mean, even this quote unquote worm that's causing these disasters in the plot synopsis that you laid out there looks eerily similar to the deer god at the end of Princess Mononoke.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so he's certainly not afraid to wear those influences while stylistically, emotionally, even from a storytelling perspective, he has his own little ethos that I do appreciate. Even if it is a little uneven at times, I do appreciate. And I think that's why I was still excited for Suzume, and I had heard good things. So I guess let's go ahead and jump right into it a little bit further. What did you think about Suzume?
We keep talking about Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki. Anytime we see a new anime filmmaker rise the ranks, it's almost inherent to compare that individual to the likes of Miyazaki. And I do think that's somewhat unfair to Makoto Shinkai because from what I've seen, especially with a movie like Your Name, it actually doesn't feel very Ghibli-esque to me. It has its own personality, which I really love about that film. But Suzume, I think, is the first time where he really tried to channel his inner Ghibli, because some of those references that we're talking about, they are pretty distracting at times.
Yeah, it's
And
pretty
I mean,
explicit. Yeah.
it's very explicit. It's almost as if he heard the comparisons, took so much love and pride in it, and decided to really try and make his own Miyazaki movie. Because the way that this flows really reminded me of movies like Spirited Away or Howl's Moving Castle. I think might even be a better comparison to how the film functions narratively. And I think that's also an apt comparison, because I do think the way this movie flows is a bit uneven. You did mention that word earlier. I don't think it's as tight as something like Your Name. And I do think that's pretty unfortunate. It has a lot of ground to cover. There are times that this 2-hour runtime starts to get kind of repetitive. There's a lot of a lot of wash, rinse, repeat happening here before it gets to the final act, which then turns into a random road trip of sorts. So, I mean, I admire the directions it's taking to really surprise us, but you could definitely sense where the narrative is kind of at its breaking point, and where some of the narrative contrivances and conveniences are placed in order to push it along. But I think the film has something that a movie like Your Name doesn't. And one thing I do like about Your Name is that it has this level of nostalgia and almost like teenage love to it, which again, it's not going to work for everyone, but I kind of like that about the film. Suzume, despite still featuring young adults as the protagonists here, it feels a little bit more sophisticated, I think. I think thematically speaking, it has more interesting ideas on its mind, not just about grief, which I'm sure you'll talk about, but really just the state of Japan as this unfortunate melting pot of natural disasters over the decades.
Yeah.
And that has been evident in many anime movies in the past, especially a movie like Your Name, which had these allegories to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But here it's very direct about the many earthquakes that have happened over the decades in Japan. And it's very literal in that regard, but I think because of that, there is a sense of melancholy to this film that I haven't really felt from Makoto Shinkai before, which is why I do like this movie. I don't love it, but I do like it because it has a more bold and daring emotional center when compared to some of his other films. I don't think it gets there as far as it functioning as a film, but I was still slightly moved by the journey Suzume goes on because of how sophisticated its themes are. So I do like it overall.
Brendan, this movie is what I like to call a JD special.
Okay, so maybe you're a little higher on this movie than I am.
This movie ultimately is about grief and closure. And how many times have I talked about that over the years? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, this is your movie.
It was right up my alley. All kidding aside, I do think this film is good and had every opportunity to be great, but I do have the same issues with it as Shinkai's other films. They're all visually wondrous, as we've been talking about. They're prominent with ambitious lore and world building, but all of that comes at the cost of storytelling and character, which, again, isn't bad per se, as much as I find it a little bit uneven. And I think this film falls under the same trappings. The visual beauty here is exquisite. In fact, there are times where Shinkai pauses just to flex his animated muscles.
Oh,
and
my!
Honestly, I respect it.
I do. Well,
respect
this is where we talked about him maybe making an anime vibe movie that's almost dialogue free, like no dialogue whatsoever. There are moments where he pauses like that, and then there are moments where, I mean, it's hard to say the camera moves because of the way that this film is made, but the way it just the way it almost blows with the wind in some of these very extravagant action set pieces, it's really beautiful at times.
It is absolutely gorgeous. And I think it complements beautifully the lore and world building that is depicted here, especially given the film's allegories, which I do want to talk more about as we go. And the dramatic urgency in those action sequences, coupled with that lore, is quite thrilling and captivating, I think. But at the same time, motivation and relationships suffer a little bit, or they're driven by contrivance, which I did find somewhat frustrating. There's one moment about 20 minutes into the film where Suzume is running after a cat and a toy chair where she yells out, "What is happening here?" And it was the perfect summation of the film to that point. Yeah, what the heck was going on? It
I
was
will
very
say,
confusing.
aesthetically, I did like the way that scene played out. I loved the music over top of it. It had this like very vibrant, like big band jazz music supporting it, almost like it was being ripped from some weird fantastical spy chase scene or something. And so I like the way he's pulling with influences there. But you're right. Yeah, my reaction was, I like that this is weird, but given the nature of this movie, I think I need more of an explanation.
I agree. And as it all unfolds, while there is some clarity, it's never fully cogent, or even
Right.
if it is, and I'm not sure if it is for me, but even if it is, it's still disjointed. Suzume's
Yeah.
aunt Tamaki is mostly in the background for most of it, but then all of a sudden becomes a prominent figure in that
Yeah.
final act and is a key piece to the film's emotional core. And while poignant, I'm not sure it's wholly earned. Same thing could be said about Suzume's mother and her ghostly presence that lingers throughout. It's touching and at times it drives character, but mostly it's an emotional MacGuffin. To be clear, I do think it all makes sense to one degree or another.
Yeah.
It just isn't always seamless.
Yeah.
But it works enough. And again, I want to be clear in this
Yeah.
that I was still compelled by it all. I was engaged with the film and visually just incredible eye candy from beginning to end.
Yeah. Did you see this in English dub or subtitles?
I saw this in its original language
Okay.
in IMAX.
Wow. Okay, you got one step above me. I saw it in its original Japanese as well, but I did not see it in IMAX. But we at least had the same experience as far as the audio itself and the
Yeah.
communication of the film. And I'm really glad I saw it the way I did, not just because we're always proponents of seeing these movies in their native tongue. We think that it conveys the emotional center that it was designed to convey in the first place. But I do wonder if the English dub wasn't very good, I would probably be way lesser on the film, because one of the film's biggest saving graces for me is actually Nanoka Hara's voice performance as Suzume. I think she's very good. She's not really established as much of a character in the beginning. We kind of have to infer that she's really just this curious, love-struck child that has some deep-rooted past that means something, but
It all happens quickly. Again, the
it does.
storytelling isn't all that cogent. You just really have to follow along and hope that you can put it all together
Right,
as it
right.
happens, which in some ways I appreciate given the visual prowess of the film. But again, it just goes back to Shinkai's approach of we're telling a grand story. There's a lot of lore, a lot of world building. There's it's going to turn into this road movie. There's 2 hours of stuff we have to get through. We don't have time to just sit here and establish a character at the beginning of the film for 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
so for better or worse, that's just something with his movies, because they all, at least the ones I've seen, tend to function that way.
They do.
And it's, again, it's one of those double-edged sword kind of things. You get great things in terms of the world building and visuals, but the characterization, like you're not going to get deep, rich, emotional, nuanced characters like you do
No.
in Miyazaki films, but you get a lot more in terms of visual and world building that Miyazaki doesn't tend to emphasize quite as much.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. And the reason why I bring this up is because I'm not sure I would have went for the movie if the voice performance for Suzume was mediocre at best.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, and again,
she's important. Yeah.
yeah, she's very important. So if there's any gap that's being filled there, or if any of those emotional gaps that you're talking about are being filled by something, it is Nanoka Hara's performance, I think. I like I said, I did not see the English dub. I'm actually not sure who voices Suzume in the English dub. It's Nicole Sakura.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
Nicole Sakura. So I have no I have no inclination whether she does a good or bad job because I just
Yeah.
don't know.
Mhm.
But if that performance doesn't work, then the movie is ultimately just one giant blank slate.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's so it's important to have an emotional center just from a vocal performance standpoint. And this at least does.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do really like the performances here, and not just in terms of how they help fill in any sort of emotional gaps that might be contrived, or even character gaps that,
Right.
because the script doesn't take the time to flesh any of it out, it has to come through the performance and the dynamic of these characters. And so they do a great job within their vocal performances. Um,
Mhm.
but I also think, it comes through in the emotional, or the score of the film is what I was trying to
Yeah.
say there. The
Yeah.
original score here. The music
Well, it's
is
emotional.
really
I'll say
good.
yeah.
It is emotional at times, for sure.
Yeah.
But the score, I think, is really great. I think that does some of the heavy lifting here, and some of the dramatic urgency as well. And sometimes it is a combination of all those things, right? Where we know that they're trying to help dissolve these disasters before they happen. And so
Yeah.
the stakes are very high. And as a result, and given some of the world building that we do come to understand, at least a little bit,
Yeah.
when they are at the doors, and the stakes are high, there's tension, they have to get these doors closed, or millions of people are going to die. You inject this this moment of mythos into it, as they're conjuring the emotion of the gods. They have
Mhm.
this key, they got to get it locked, the score's ramping up, it's getting really thrilling.
Yeah.
Like all of that, like to me, that's Shinkai at his best. Like
I
those
agree.
moments here are really great.
I
So
agree.
even though he doesn't take time to establish anything in terms of here's what it is, like he's not going to spell it out for us, which I kind of appreciate. So even though
Yeah.
I don't fully understand what's happening, I see it play out, and as I noted, I found those moments quite engrossing.
Well, I think why they're engrossing as well, and something that I think Shinkai does rightfully here, is actually going back to this notion we were bringing up about how not just Suzume, but many of the characters here aren't really all that fleshed out. But I think in this case, it's arguably the right choice because this movie really isn't just about one or two people. It's really about all of Japan.
It is, yeah.
And this kind of gets into the film's thematic notions. I'm sure you want to talk more about its notions on grief, but it's tackling that notion as if it affected all of Japan over the past century, honestly,
Mhm.
because the
Yeah.
way grief is manifested here and the grief that everyone is dealing with is really due to the many disasters, most notably earthquakes that killed many people over the years in Japan. And that's
Mhm.
really what it is. And that relates directly to Suzume, as we find out as well. She is living with her aunt. She no longer has her mother. And the details as to why that is are very much in parallel to what her and what's her colleague's name? Suta. What the two of them
Yeah.
are doing and what their goal is. It's very much working in parallel with that. So
Mhm.
the film is really about everyone affected by those disasters. So to keep the characters a bit less defined, I think allows maybe people of Japan who maybe live through those things to project their own
Mhm.
grief into the movie, which I do respect.
Yeah.
It does maybe get a little specific when it gets to the end, once the film's central romance kind of takes hold.
Mhm.
But by that point, I was kind of with it, and I at least appreciate the film's thematic notions on how it handles grief because I like when movies try to invite the audience into that conversation.
Mhm.
I think this one does.
I completely agree. And I think what's interesting about its allegories on grief and closure is that it ciphers it, broadly speaking, but
Yeah.
also on an individual level.
Yeah,
But
it
to
does
your
both.
point, even when it gets into the nuance of Suzume specifically, it is something that a lot of people will be able to relate with. It's
Sure.
not
Yeah.
so out of bounds that it's exclusive to, to Suzume
Yeah.
and nobody else. But I do like that approach. I think that's what's so compelling to me about this becoming a road movie and us getting
It's an
to
interesting
explore
choice.
all of
Yeah.
Japan, because everyone in that area has suffered, has experienced these earthquakes or these natural disasters. It's affected them in some way or another. And so there is this shared experience that isn't spoken, but we do see that the characters have an understanding of that shared experience.
Yeah.
So the film kind of explores this idea as a result of that shared experience to just be kind to each other, to help
Yeah, it's a
one
simple
another
notion.
in need. As simple as it is, because at every stop, we see these random characters help Suzume out, whether it's giving her a ride or just helping her in some sort of way, going out of their way to help her. And in return, she returns those favors back, whether it be washing dishes or sweeping the floor or babysitting or whatever it may be, as she's on this journey throughout all of Japan. And internally, she's, of course, grappling with her own grief and yearning for closure. And she feels like she's doing something important. And along the way, she comes across these random characters who see her struggling, who see that sadness, and they help. They just lend a helping hand.
Yeah.
And she accepts it and she receives it gracefully. And I think that in and of itself is a fascinating idea that you could certainly talk about with this film.
I
and
agree.
How she
I agree.
kind of returns it. So like it's this really simple thing. Just be kind to each other that I think isn't so simple in reality. Like you look at our society and our culture, and like that feels like it's from a bygone era. Like,
JD, I just want to punch you in the face right now.
like, like I could walk down, and maybe I live in Florida, which is a disaster.
Yeah, don't do that.
If I walk down the street and if I'm in a situation like Suzume where I need a ride or it's pouring rain and I'm at a bus stop and nothing's coming for hours, no one's stopping to give me a ride to the next town. Like that doesn't happen here.
Right.
Maybe in other parts of the United States that could be the case.
Maybe. I mean,
fingers crossed.
I mean, maybe Minnesota, which is kind of like the U.S. version of Canada. So
yeah, we lived in Kentucky for a while. There's like a southern hospitality to that state where I could see that potentially happening.
Yeah, I think Lexington in particular. When I lived in Louisville, it wasn't quite there. It was definitely more evident in Lexington. But you're right. I think a state like Kentucky is probably more evident of it than, let's say, Florida.
Yeah. And look, I say all that to say that on its face, you look at that and maybe it seems trivial or maybe it's, vapid. I don't think that's the case, but I could, like, on its face, I could see how that feels trite. And yet there's something about it, given the pathos of this film, again, that shared experience, and that broad idea that it feels like it doesn't exist in our world anymore, that I found it honestly really refreshing here.
I did for the most part too, but selfishly, I wish we got more time between Suzume and these characters that you're talking about, just being friendly towards one another.
It is fleeting. But maybe that gives it more power in some ways, because these are people that just come in and out of your lives in a brief moment, and yet they're still willing to lend a helping hand. I just don't know if I see that all that often.
Well, I think the idea of them being fleeting makes sense. But I think maybe where it falls a little short for me is how distracted I started to feel when those sequences then got interrupted by Suzume talking to a walking chair.
Fair.
So, okay, I guess for a little context for those who haven't seen the film, and this is not a spoiler, this is in the first third.
This
it's
is
part of the setup.
On.
It's part of the setup. This is basically a relationship of sorts between Suzume and a male character named Sauta, I believe his name is. He is voiced by Hokuto Matsumura. And this is, the classic Shinkai romantic partnership, if you will, that he likes to explore. But
Yeah.
at one point early on, before we even get to know him as a character, he is transformed into a walking chair.
With 3 legs, not
with
4
three
legs.
legs, with 3 legs. And he is that chair for maybe 95% of the movie.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
already it's kind of hard to establish a character relationship between an object and a person like that. But again, I do feel like that relationship then becomes a bit distracting for those fleeting moments that you're talking about between Suzume and these many characters that she encounters throughout her journey. And I would have liked to maybe see, maybe not necessarily more time with those respective characters, but less of that strange distraction that then became more of a momentum for plot than anything else. And that's where I think Shinkai gets a little lost in his storytelling there.
Well, and I don't disagree. I think those moments in a microcosm are great. I really love them. I think of that moment when she's babysitting those 3 kids, and again,
Okay, that was cute. That was cute, and the way the
really
chair
endearing.
gets integrated into that is
Yeah, that was great.
that's the one moment where I felt like, okay, all of this is now working in like perfect synergy.
Yeah.
Like now it's starting to mesh. But
Yeah, there was a symmetry there that I thought was great.
yeah.
But to your broader point, and we talked about this in our opening thoughts of the film, it is a little disjointed. I do agree with that overall sentiment that the broader thematic allegory, the shared experiences, this road movie that takes place here, it isn't always seamless with the individual journey
Right.
that Suzume is on, even though I love that dichotomy.
Yep.
And speaking of, I do want to talk about that a little bit further because, as I noted, this is a JD special after all, right?
It is.
Because this is a movie about or this is an allegory on grief.
Are we
and
sure Michael
closure.
Shannon didn't voice a character in this movie?
Maybe he did secretly. Who knows?
Maybe. Yeah.
But I do love that here, and I love how it's incorporated into these little moments that we see throughout the film where Suzume does get to reflect on why she's on this journey in the first place. Specifically, we see these flashes of this notebook, right? When she's a little kid and she's drawing these black lines throughout the page, which is incredible foreshadowing, but also symbolic of her grief. And it just becomes this incredible idea where she has become, on this journey with Suta, she's become this mechanism that helps stops these disasters, these earthquakes from forming, which is an especially powerful notion once we find out how her mother died when she was young. And it suggests how much of what we see is just a manifestation of her grief. Maybe that's all
Maybe that's all it is. And it's
And
basically
what-
it's her journey to try and save other people from what she went through, even though that's not clearly spelled out. And she probably doesn't even realize that's what she's doing, which is really ironic. And I think there's beauty in that too.
I agree. I don't know if there's a better way to cope, to find closure, than by suppressing the very thing that brought trauma to her life.
Yeah.
Either way, whether it's a manifestation of her grief or whether it's literal, I think it works both ways. But I do find that incredibly relatable and very moving with how it all tethers at the end with this vision that she has of herself in the after ever. And, you know, like there's through one of those engrossing moments of dramatic urgency that is presented to us for the first time. Really the second time, because I guess the opening scene of the film kind of establishes it as well.
Yeah, that's true.
But then it comes back in the Ferris wheel moment, and then it all crystallizes at the end, and how all of that comes together in terms of her finding closure through this very specific event that took something from her. And now she is on this path, finding purpose in her life, suppressing the very things that brought her that trauma in the first place.
Sure.
I find that incredibly moving here. And again, it is something that many of us, especially those that experienced that 2011 earthquake in Japan.
Yep.
But really, many of the disasters that area has experienced over the decades, as we noted earlier, people
Yeah.
will certainly be able to relate with that, which is why I love the individual element of it, and this one person, this one young woman finding healing through this symbolic gesture of sorts, which is what I love so much about why she's so urgent here. I can almost like, this is one of those great movies, or this great irony, I guess, where we don't get to know her outside of her grief all that much. She's not established well at the beginning, as we noted, but all of that urgency, all of that I have to do this, makes so much sense by the end because of how that grief is manifested in this allegory. Like to me, it does make a lot of sense that you can make the argument, do we even need to know her in any other way? I don't know if we do.
Well, yeah, I don't think we really do. I think at times the film wants us to, when the central relationship, but I think for the most part, not always, I'd say maybe like 65 to 70% of the time, Makoto Shinkai is able to have his cake and eat it too, by being broad and specific at the same time with regard to Suzume as a character. Because there are many instances when her journey takes her to places that are very specific to Japan, but that's where the broadness comes into play, right? Because then it becomes about all of Japan.
It becomes about everybody kind of going through it.
And Shinkai has been known to reference Japanese history in that way. And this one does get pretty specific in that regard. I'm sure that there will be think pieces written about this film tracing the historical accuracy of some of these disasters that are being referenced here. There are abandoned places, like abandoned amusement parks, for instance, that are directly referenced here, which I don't know offhand if there is any direct tie to some historical landmark in Japan that was wiped away by some earthquake or something like that. I don't know the details there. Maybe one of our listeners can educate us on that.
Sure. Yeah.
But I wouldn't be surprised if that dissection starts to happen because of this movie. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is accuracy to it. It does seem like Shinkai did maybe more research this time around, trying to be a bit historically specific to what has affected Japan over the years. To the point that I would almost call this a Japanese history film at times.
Yeah.
But that's weirdly the part I like the most. And maybe he should just make a Japanese documentary in anime form or something.
Yeah.
And I might be all in that.
Well, and the interesting thing is that I tend to believe that even if these specific references or these locations that he takes us to, in regards to not the towns, obviously we know that the cities exist, but the Ferris wheel.
I thought Tokyo didn't
example,
exist, JD. Are you telling me Tokyo is a real place?
Well, my point in bringing that up is to say, like, everything outside of the worm and one of the central characters turning into a chair is in
talking cats,
real world.
Can't forget talking cats
and a talking cat. Yeah,
I mean, like, this is Whisper of the Heart after all.
Like, you remove the mysticism, but in terms of plotting, or not really plotting, but in terms of like the world in which we are experiencing this through, it, as far as I know, it is this lived in real world. It's one that feels tangible. It's one that we recognize. So I would imagine that if that middle school doesn't exist, it's certainly inspired by something that is very real.
Yeah. It's a reference to a reference to something that may or may not exist. Even if it's not like by name the exact school that was maybe affected by that particular disaster that affected, let's say, Kobe, Japan, for instance.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if it's not that specific, it's still referencing something specific. And that's honestly all you really need to at least be maybe not historically accurate, but respectful towards history, which this one is.
I completely agree. And I do love that. I think that adds further pathos to the emotional core of this film that I do think is very moving. One element of the allegory, though, I do have questions about. These are less criticisms and more so thoughts that I need to grapple with, and
Okay.
perhaps rewatches of the film might enlighten me a little bit, because I'm not entirely sure. And maybe through this conversation, maybe you'll be able to help me with this, but I'm not entirely sure that yearning for closure as Suzume grapples with her grief is an effective cipher for romanticism. The idea of her moving on or being scared to
Yeah.
lose someone else that she loves is certainly powerful. It is cogent enough here, but her relationship with Suta feels mutually exclusive to her grief until they collide at the very end of the film. But that's why it feels a little manufactured to me, because through most of the film, they are separate through lines.
Yeah.
And again, maybe a rewatch will help remedy that gap for me, but on a first watch, it didn't feel seamless. And there's something about using her mother's death as a way to find Suta that, emotionally speaking anyway, is maybe a little disingenuous. I don't know if that's the
Yeah.
right word, but it feels a little off to me. Thematically
Well,
speaking, it makes sense. But emotionally, maybe a little insipid.
in a way, this makes me wish that Suzume could have been the first film from Makoto Shinkai I ever saw, because I wonder if we're looking at Suzume and Sota's relationship as romantic simply because we're comparing it to the works of Makoto Shinkai. And this is a common trope of his. Uh, but if we isolate the film away from that, I'm wondering if it's possible to view their relationship as platonic.
I
Uh,
don't know.
well, see, this is where.
I don't know.
Well, I think the thing that maybe collapses that argument is the way that they're introduced in the first literal 3 minutes of the movie, which is literally them walking past each other and staring at each other as if, oh, you're cute, I like you.
Well, and
Which-
doesn't she reference something to his physical beauty? Like, she says something about that.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
But I guess I say that to say, I think this would have been one of those times that Shinkai probably should have slightly broken away from one of his usual tropes and maybe make this more of a platonic friendship, because I think that could have maybe justified a little bit further where the film goes, because I think in doing so, maybe it makes the outcome at the end a little less, not even disingenuous, maybe a little icky, as if it's trying to take advantage of
Yeah.
her grief for some type of selfish gain like
It
that.
feels a
But
little exploitative. I'm not going to lie. And that
Yeah.
to me is, again, and maybe I just need to revisit the film. Its idea, I understand what it's aiming for. This idea that, we find closure from our grief, we find love, we want to cling to that because we could lose it at any moment. Like, it makes sense. I just don't know if the exploitative nature, because I do think, as I noted, her grief and the foreshadowing of the book, what that
Yeah.
means, what happened to her mother, the symbolic gesture of, I have to mitigate these disasters, I have to defeat this worm because of what happened to my mother. And again, I loved all of that. To me, that is a really powerful allegory that I think we
Yeah.
all wrestle with in our lives in some way or another.
yeah,
And then you get to the end, and the film uses that again. That's why I used the word MacGuffin earlier, because ultimately that's what it is. It becomes a cipher, not for her grief when she enters that door, or when she even goes to her house there at the end. It really is less about closure, and it's more so about romanticism at that point. It's about finding Sota. So
yeah.
like, I don't know if that was the right way to do that, or at least that didn't work for me. If it did for others, that's great. I just don't know
Yeah.
if that's something that I really liked, I guess.
No, I get you.
Subjectively.
I get you. And I think in order to fix that would have been one of two things. Maybe that relationship should have been more platonic, like I'm saying, or I think regardless of what direction Shinkai would have went with that central relationship, I think we needed Suzume's mother to be an actual character here, as opposed to just being a plot point by the end.
Perhaps, yeah.
Because if she at least had a little bit more agency, maybe she had her own point of view. Maybe if we would have had, I don't know, some Disney Pixar up like revelation at the end with My Adventure Book, like that moment at the end that sort of it's this epiphany for the Carl Fredricksen character. Something like that
Yeah.
were to exist in this movie from the perspective of Suzume's mother,
Yes.
then maybe we
Yes.
could have pushed it towards that, as
I
if that
agree.
now she is being told that she's allowed to fight for something that's
Yeah.
away from this grief.
I agree.
And that's maybe another component that the film is missing.
I agree. And maybe there's a missed opportunity here within the screenplay. Again, not that that's ever his first priority here, but there's a missed opportunity because there's the aunt character, right? And
Yeah.
again, she's mostly in the background, which is why it's still a little disjointed for me when she becomes such a vital piece at the end. But maybe if you're going to write the mother the way you do, perhaps you manifest that idea you're talking about through the aunt character, that she kind of speaks about her sister, Suzume's mother, and
Yeah.
gives permission to that somehow, like through some sort of verbal exchange or some sort of emotional moment they have together.
Right.
That you
Yeah.
kind of give permission to that. But that doesn't happen. Like the aunt character, there's a couple of, again, in a microcosm, there's some really touching moments between the two, but I also think it's underutilized and ultimately a little wasteful.
There's one scene between the two of them that I think is very good up until a point. And it's the argument that they have at this what looks like a gas station, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And that whole scene introduces something that could have been compelling and led into what you're talking about there, that I think this film sorely needed, and
Yeah.
then gets rudely interrupted by plot again, by talking
Yeah.
cats.
Yeah. Exactly.
And then
a
that,
second one that shows up out of nowhere.
oh my gosh. I'll tell you what, if there's another huge missed opportunity here, it's those freaking cats. Because
Yeah.
the way that their arcs crystallize at the end, I mean, talk about convenient.
And confounding. Honestly, like I'm trying to recall the name. And forgive me, I'm going to butcher this name. It's something like Dejin.
Dejin, something like that.
Something to that. Because I have no idea what is motivating that character or why it's making the choices it does. It's very, very tediously confounding.
Yeah.
Because it makes choices that are clearly that are clearly undermining Suzume.
Yeah.
There's really no ambiguity there, yet the character thinks it's doing something in service of Suzume, which becomes a little bit more cogent, I guess, through that third act turn that we get. But from an emotional perspective, in terms of like when he becomes disappointed that, when she's like, I don't like you, I'll say vaguely.
I mean, you say it vaguely, it sounds very randomly out of context, but it's actually not.
Yeah, when she has that moment, he's like, "Whoa, you don't like me? What did I do?" And it's like, "What do you mean? What did you do?" Like, it's very clear. And it's like,
and then it's like, oh, okay, you do like me again. I guess I can save the world.
yeah,
now.
and which again, like, I'm not opposed to those reactions on their own terms. My problem is there's nothing within the screenplay to make sense of those choices, and so it just becomes like, what is this what is the purpose of this character other than to become a godlike figure to turn one human into a chair?
Maybe there's some reference to Japanese folklore that we're aware of. That might be like the Miyazaki effect or something like that, because he tends to do that in a lot of his movies, putting Japanese religion into his movies that actually have like this secret meaning that if you don't understand the religiosity of it, you might find them to feel like plot contrivances, and maybe that's happening here. But
I would be willing to hear from someone on that. Like,
Yeah.
I'm open to education
Yeah.
in that regard. And the religiosity of it, I certainly have. I'm not opposed to that. There's clearly some sort of mythical nature to it. And
Yeah.
I did read a little bit about the Keystones and where Shinkai was, coming from in terms of using that in terms of Japanese lore.
Right.
Like, I don't have an issue with that. That is not my problem. The issue for me, and maybe this relates back to what you're talking about, or maybe it's just bad writing. I don't know. But the choices the character makes, what is motivating that character? What's driving those choices? What's driving this confusion within the character itself? Why? Like, what do you mean Suzume doesn't like me? Like, the character is confused as to
Yeah.
why Suzume reacts that way when we as the audience wholly understand.
Yeah.
Like, that to me isn't clear from a writing perspective. So it makes that exchange just very bizarre. Like,
It's bizarre.
I don't
Yeah.
understand the purpose of that.
Yeah, I don't either. I'm hard pressed to still call it a plot contrivance, regardless of the religious meaning behind it, if there is
Mhm.
one. But even so, in execution, it just feels random's not the right word. But quick-witted, forced, maybe. I don't know. It doesn't justify where it goes for me. I that was a head scratch. It really was.
Mhm. I completely agree. The last little thought that I had about this film, and then we can kind of, I guess, conclude this conversation here. So there's one moment where, and this kind of circles back to what I was saying earlier about the film's romanticism. And again, this is certainly more of a question, more of I'd like to revisit the film and look at this perhaps through another perspective, because there's a moment where Suzume meets up with Suta's grandfather in the hospital. Is that who he is? I'm trying to
Yes, that's
remember.
his
Or an uncle?
grandfather. Yeah,
Grandfather?
he said grandfather.
Yeah. Now there's a really fascinating exchange here, and I'll do my
Yeah.
best to avoid spoilers, right? Because there is a sacrifice that is made, and I think the film, and this is where I'll give Shinkai some credit, because I think he does a great job of offering credence to that sacrifice,
Yeah, agreed.
and this idea that he perhaps it's not what Suta wanted, but it is a gesture that means something profound. And instead of letting him relish in that because of her own desires,
Yeah.
she's like, nope, I'm going to go get him. I don't care what you say, old man.
Mm-hmm.
I find that interestingly provocative. Like, I could
Well,
see the argument kind of go both ways there.
well, I think it depends on how we respond to it as viewers, because
Mhm.
if we look at that and think Shinkai is trying to get us to root for her choice there, then I think there are problems. I think that's where it becomes maybe more problematic. But
Mhm.
I don't know if I saw it that way. I'm kind of with you that I think there is something kind of ambiguous about how we're supposed to feel about that choice that she makes, if it's actually for the greater good or not, or if it's going to lead to some further ramifications that she must then take responsibility for. Uh, I found myself thinking about that, but not in a way that might be a flaw for the movie. I
Mhm.
think there is a balance between sweetness but bitterness at the same time there that
Mhm.
I did kind of like.
Yeah, and I just wonder because, and we talked earlier about the central allegory of this film and
Yeah.
Suzume fighting off these disasters and what that means for her given her experience with her own mother. I kind of wonder what that would be, what the impact of that would be if she lets Suta again relish in his sacrifice
Yeah.
and channels that further to focus that energy on her grief toward her mother,
Yeah.
and then somehow tying it to that sacrifice. there's
Well, yeah.
something there that feels like maybe a missed opportunity
Well,
that
I think
I think would
that
be
gets
more powerful, more
gets
ambiguous,
back in,
maybe.
that gets back into something we talked about earlier about not making Suzume's mother more of a character. I mean, we
Hmm.
barely sense her in some of these flashbacks, but I mean, all we do is hear her voice every now and then. We remember her as Suzume remember. We don't even remember her as Suzume really remembers her.
Hmm.
I mean, she was really young when her mother passed, but there was clearly a connection that she had with her that we also need to feel and understand as an audience. And I don't
Hmm.
know if the film quite gets there. And there could have been some interesting parallel at work between Suzume and her mom in comparison to Sauta and his grandfather.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think there is potentially a missed opportunity there for sure.
Well, and I think about, to your point there specifically, we do get the flashback of her mother, the scene, the moment when she builds the chair for
Great
Suzume.
scene. Great
Great
scene.
moment. But it's the only one we get. And it's
Yeah.
mutually exclusive to the Suta through line.
It's mutually
None of
exclusive to the
that,
plot. Yeah.
yeah, none of it is they are two very separate ideas that collide at the end. And when they do, it does feel like a little bit of a mess. So like I
Yeah.
don't think it all
Yeah.
comes together very well, even though I like those separate things on their own terms. And again, in microcosms, you look at every scene on their own terms, and I think there's a lot to love in terms of character, in terms of visuals,
Hmm.
everything we've talked about with Shinkai as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
So, again, that's why I think at the beginning of this conversation, my opening thoughts, I was like, I do think this film is good.
Yeah.
It could have been great. Like it's like the pieces are there for this to be great, and it just is a little detached from each other to me.
Sometimes these conversations we have, JD, tend to formulate our thoughts on movies as we go, especially if we're kind of wrestling with a few things. And admittedly, when we started recording this, I had just gotten out of my screening of the film an hour before, maybe 30 minutes beforehand.
Yeah, sure.
So to say I'm fresh in this conversation would be an understatement. I'm actually
Yeah,
surprised we were able to go this long on it.
yeah.
Um, but I have to say, this is actually one of those cases where I'll stand by saying that I do like the film. I don't love it, but this conversation is making me like it slightly less as we go. And it's well,
Okay.
not
Wow.
much, but
Okay.
it's mostly because I keep going back to that potential that just wasn't
Yeah,
fulfilled.
that's fair. Yeah.
And maybe that's not fair to the film because I still think the things that are strong are very strong, and I do love the attempt at more thematic and emotional sophistication when compared to something like Your Name that had more of a, I don't want to say music video vibe, but it almost kind of did. Like it definitely
Hmm.
felt like a man in high school making a high school movie. Whereas this
Sure.
feels like an adult trying to make a high school movie. But tonally, it does have a slightly different sense, and I like that. I just wish the story was more fulfilled in that regard.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I'm missing that. And I keep going back to that, just knowing how great this could have been.
Well, and maybe that kind of circles back to what we know of him as a filmmaker and the
Yeah.
energies and his sensibilities, and what you said earlier of him trying to mimic Miyazaki, like him trying to do
Yeah.
his version of a Ghibli film. And maybe those sensibilities just don't mesh all that well. And
Yeah,
that's
I think,
fine.
and that's
But
fine. I mean, I like his previous films that I've seen because they
same.
don't feel like Ghibli. But this is
I
the
agree.
first time I feel like this is the closest I think he has come to kind of mimicking some of the Ghibli sensibilities. And I don't think they fit into his wheelhouse as much as I think he wants them to. And maybe that's not his goal. Maybe he was just trying to put some references here and there. But
Mhm.
I think he I'm not going to say he should stick to what he knows because I like when filmmakers try new things. And I like that
Mhm.
Shinkai made this movie and I like that he made it in the way that he did. He thought it served the story and he was doing something maybe a little bit tonally different, which I appreciate.
Mhm.
But I do wish it was still more of his own voice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I do think it is here, especially
It
in
is,
terms
yeah.
of the aesthetic value of the film. And
Yeah, that's
as
still
we
him.
noted earlier, I love how often this film pauses just to flex its animated muscles, like for no other reason
Yeah.
other than this shot's pretty awesome, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, it is.
Oh, there are times
Especially in
he's
IMAX, it's
purely
pretty great.
showing off. That was that was
Yeah,
fun to see.
I
Yeah, you're not wrong.
admire that ambition for sure. I
Yeah.
do love that. But also in terms of how big this story is, there's a lot of lore here. There's a lot of mythical elements that are established very early on and never dissipate. In fact, that mythos only gets bigger and bigger. The stakes get higher and higher as you go.
Yep.
Miyazaki doesn't include mythos that way. Like that's very different than the Ghibli way of doing it.
Right.
But when you include like those elements of character and family and emotion, which are, certainly prominent in his other movies, but he is doing it in a more, I don't know, mature way.
Yeah.
In a Ghibli way, like coming from that kind of tonal
It's more
precision,
graceful.
I guess.
He knows how to fuse it all together and make it of a piece. And a lot of times it's because those things are very much in the background. I mean, a movie like My Neighbor Totoro puts so little focus on those things, yet you can always find things like that to talk about and dissect. But there's something so humane and simple about a movie like that that doesn't get as bogged down by that world building. Whereas Shinkai kind of needs it a little bit. It's more of a backbone for his stories.
I agree. No, I think that's very well said.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on Suzume?
I don't think so. I will echo the music here. You mentioned that earlier in your opening thoughts, I think. I do think the music here is very good. I want to give some credit where credit is due. So as we're talking, I'm going to pull up the composers here. I know it's 2 composers, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't even know if I want to try and pronounce these names, but Kazuma Janucci and Radwimps. I don't know who Radwimps is, but I do love that name.
According to this, it's a Japanese rock band.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. And they've apparently worked with Shinkai on a few occasions. I see them credited here as composers for Weathering with You, as well as working the music department for Your Name. And yeah, there is definitely a song and dance vibe at times here that we've seen from Shinkai before. It's just it's more focused on balladry as opposed to punk rock or pop punk like we heard before, which I will say I do think fits the tone of this movie better. Given the themes at play, I do like that it is a little bit more somber, a little bit more melancholic, and I appreciate those tonal differences.
I agree. I think when you're talking about the dramatic urgency of the film, I think the music is really good in heightening the tension there.
Yeah.
And the emotional beats, I think, are well accompanied as well. So, yeah, I do really like the music here. And because this is a film that is driven by grand storytelling and plotting, the music does have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in order to make a lot of these scenes work. And, and it's effective. It does its job. So
it does. You're right.
Similar to what you were talking about with the performances earlier, the score, if it's any lesser, I think this film does suffer, but
it does. Yeah,
it is really good. The performances on the whole are very good. The visuals are great. I love what this film is going for. And at times the emotion did pack a wallop for me. Even if moments later it's undermined by romanticism or something else. So or just confounding
or talking cats and talking chairs.
Yeah. And some of that could be my own personal ignorance. I'm certainly willing to admit that, and I'd be willing to be educated and to watch the film through a more educated prism.
Yep.
But on this first go around, and I think my issues at the end of the day, like even if I am able to find someone who can help fill in the gaps in terms of the religiosity and the lore here and what it all means, I don't know if the writing will fix my fundamental issues here.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I'm with you on that. There's a big difference between symbolism as opposed to writing or in storytelling.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the storytelling is just uneven.
Yeah.
As you know, and that's been my experience with a lot of his other movies. So
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I feel the same about this as I do the ones that I have seen of his. And that's probably what I'll just expect from him going forward. So, and that's, again, not a bad thing because
he's making good movies.
He makes good movies, and there's a lot to appreciate about them. You know, not every filmmaker is going to be like, not everyone can be Miyazaki. You can't just be cranking out masterpiece after masterpiece all the time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, that's perfectly fine. You know,
I agree.
I'm okay with that. Anyway, those are our thoughts on Suzume. If you agree or disagree with any of our thoughts, be sure to let us know. Hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. Letterboxd, you can hit us up there.
Yep.
Letterboxd.com/insessionfilm. All right, before we get out of here, my friend, any final thoughts on anything?
It's good to have you back, JD. Officially, I'm calling it right now. You're back now. Brandy, I love you, but your husband's back. I miss these conversations. You know, I love the conversations that I have with Ryan and Jay. Don't get me wrong, and I love that we're able to keep carrying our own banter forward as you still take some time to regroup and get used to new daddy duties once again. But I mean, you and I do a lot of reviews together for a reason. And once again, we're hitting 70 minutes on a review. So what else is new?
What else is new? This is what we do.
Yeah.
You know, and it's funny because we're doing this at the same time that Ryan and Jay are talking about In the Mood for Love.
Oh, yeah. They probably have their own 3-hour review at play right now.
Probably. So it is kind of funny. Like, the four of us have come together, obviously, for anyone that's been watching, listening to the show since we reshuffled everything back in January. And yet we still find these moments in time where it's old main show and old extra films still kind of having their fun together.
Oh, yeah.
But it's good. No, but it's been fun to have Ryan and Jay on the main show, and you know, getting to hear them every week has been great. So, hearing Ryan and Jay go off about HBO Max, incredible fun.
What is this Max that you're talking about, man?
No idea. At any rate, you be sure to go check out episode 530. Where Brennan and the guys talked about Russell Crowe, and they talked about Warner Brothers Discovery and whatever nonsense they're up to.
Yep.
And we hope that you enjoyed this conversation. You'll see more of me-ish coming soon in the final week. So anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. What was up with that cat? I still don't get it.
Forget about it, JD. Just go watch hockey.